beforehand. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. It is great having everybody here. I greatly appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to stop by, to check out what it is that we do. As always, we try to provide a liberty-oriented perspective to a variety of different topics and see how they kind of these topics kind of match up to what we were intended to be, a constitutional republic and a very liberty-oriented society versus kind of what we've evolved into or what we've become, and I think potentially what can be. So with that being said, I have a couple housekeeping items here. This next coming week, I'm not sure yet. I'm going to try and put something out either tomorrow or Monday with the new offshoot that I'm going to do in Defense of Liberty, which is going to cover basically how you can get involved, different ways that you can get involved at the local level, the state level, etc., and basically how you can kind of become more of a invested into the fight for liberty and how to kind of secure your states and all of those wonderful things, as well as hopefully being able to provide a little bit more resources for education and being able to learn about a variety of different subjects. So that's something I'm slowly but surely trying to work on, and I'm hoping to have all of that ironed out to the best of my ability, either by tomorrow or Monday. So I will update everybody on that. In addition, with that, I'm hopefully going to be having two people from the American Liberty Caucus that are fairly, I would say, pretty smart people that are really involved in the bill and legislation proposal process, and they're hopefully going to be able to help us understand how to create and formulate legislation and bills, how they can be proposed, and hopefully to get those things moving in the states, because I think that's a really, really important area that if we're really serious about trying to affect change, is a fruitful area to get involved in. So we're going to be looking at that, I think, around May 17th. So stay tuned for that as well. Without further ado, we have Tom Eddlem back, and it is a great pleasure to have you back, sir. And for those of you who may not have seen the first episode, he is a William Norman Grigg Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. He's written several pieces, many of which within recent weeks I have had the opportunity to read, and I think he does some really good work. And overall, he's a pretty smart guy. So thank you for coming back tonight, and I'm really glad to have you here for this discussion.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, Jeremy.
All right. So when we had initially had a conversation, I think it was a couple weeks ago, shortly after you were on the first episode, we had kind of talked about fascism, and you had pointed me to the first piece, I believe it was, that you had written, and I'd had some time to kind of look through that, and I was like, all right, well, this is a pretty interesting subject, because there's some nuance to it. There's some areas that maybe I wasn't super familiar with, but now I have a little bit better of an understanding in relation to fascism, but also really kind of how it involves the United States per se, and our perception of how our government works and how the economy works. But before we get too far ahead, I think it's important people understand kind of a brief history, if you will, of fascism, and kind of where it somewhat originated, but also kind of going through some of the myths that we have about it, like associating everything with Hitler, for instance. If it's fascist, it's by default Nazism, or it's Hitler, or it's something adjacent to that. So if you'd like, I'll let you kind of elaborate on that, and we can kind of lay the groundwork for what our discussion will be tonight.
Sure. The beginning of fascism is Mussolini. Mussolini was a leftist during World War I. He wrote for the socialist publication Avanti, and he became disillusioned with the socialist message and what had happened, especially in Russia after World War I. Lenin actually regretted losing Mussolini. He thought he was a very talented leader. He had written a couple of times that, oh, it's too bad we lost Mussolini.
Sure.
But Mussolini, he was the soil of fascism, to to borrow a phrase from John T. Flynn, because he out of him fascism grew. And
Sure.
there were other fascist powers or nations that grew up in the 1930s. Mussolini was in the 20s. Germany, also Spain and Portugal, and some
Mhm.
people would include Japan in that mix as well.
Sure.
But one of the great classical liberal writers of the 1930s, John T. Flynn, he put together a book in 1944 during World War II. It was published during World War II of, well, what are we fighting against? What is fascism? How can we define it?
Yeah.
Because Mussolini didn't really appear to have much of a set ideology. That was the thing. He'd try one thing and try something else and tries one thing. But there were certain themes as he studied. Now, he studied just 3 fascist countries. He studied Italy, Spain, and Germany under Hitler.
Sure.
And he found 8 common characteristics. 2 are political and 6 are economic. So the first two are the non-political ones, which are the government has no restraints. It's totalitarianism, like they can do whatever it wants.
Mhm.
The second one is the leadership principle. The responsibility is in one man's hand. In Italy, they called Mussolini Duce, the boss. In Hitler, they had Führerprinzip, which the Führer meant leader principle, and it meant the Führer was the leader. In Spain, the dictator was Franco. Those were the common themes. The economic ones were a little different. They were a little nebulous, because there was difference between them, the different fascist nations, between Germany and Italy. For example, in Germany there was a fair amount of socialism. They had the world's largest state-owned conglomerate called the Reichswerk, which was run by Hermann Göring. But for the most part, they followed Mussolini's path of, okay, yes, they had the state-owned corporations like Volkswagen and others, but they also had private institutions like IG Farben and Krupp, who were working with the German, hand in glove with the German state, just as in Italy, private corporations like Fiat were working with Mussolini's government. Let me just go through what John T. Flynn had said, because I think that's probably the best way to frame this, because he took a real academic approach to this. Let me see if I can find it. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So as I've already outlined the first 2, and he says these are the economic ones, in which government is organized to operate the capitalist system and enable it to function under an immense bureaucracy. Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. So there's capitalism, but there's an immense bureaucracy, and that was the common case in all of them. Even in Nazi Germany, Hitler's party was the National Socialist Party. They had some socialism, but they also had the capitalist system under an immense bureaucracy, in which the economic society is organized on the syndicalist model. That is, and he sort of explains what syndicalism is briefly, by producing groups formed into craft and professional categories under the supervision of the state. All right, and we can talk about that more later too. In which the government and the syndicalist organizations operate the capitalist society on the planned autarchical principle. Autarky is simply self-sufficiency. It means we don't need to import goods. We have everything that we need in our own country, or at least in our country plus our colonies and empire. 6, in which the government holds itself responsible to provide the nation with adequate purchasing power by public spending and borrowing. So there are jobs programs, and it's done with a deficit. And one of the
Sure.
points that Flynn makes is Mussolini never balanced a budget. Hitler never balanced a budget. Franco, I don't think balanced a budget. I don't remember. I'm
Interesting.
trying. It's been a while, but they lived on deficit spending and borrowing. Okay.
Interesting.
And jobs programs. Now these are also very key, these last two, in which militarism is used as a conscious mechanism of government spending, in which imperialism is included as a policy inevitably flowing from militarism, as well as other elements of fascism. So you've got militarism, war making, and general jingoistic patriotism, and all the negative, not the I love my country, but other countries are awful. That's why I love my country.
Oh yes.
You know, I mean, it's not so much I love America. It's America is great, and all the other countries are, to borrow a phrase from Donald Trump, they're all shithole countries. Okay. And I'm not saying that makes Donald Trump a fascist. We can go over in more detail, but that it's that kind of, jingoism, the raw militarism and the attitude of militarism and the attitude of my country is superior to the other countries. Sure. Okay. So that's the basic summary.
Sure. And, it's interesting, especially the last part, because I think there is kind of a glaring point there, which kind of binds everything that you just said. And anybody who's ever read any of the works or listened to anything that the 10th Amendment Center has put out, Michael Bolden has a favorite phrase, and I absolutely love it. And he calls it federal supremacy or the federal supremacist. And I think when he uses those terms, when I think of the comparison to like other countries, and how they're just terrible, they're not great or whatever the case is. I kind of see that attitude, when Michael Bolden likens the federal government, the contemporary federal government and their supporters as like federal supremacists, if you will. It's almost like they have that same attitude towards the states, and there's a repulsion even to really any mention of like the 10th Amendment. And I'm not trying to go too far off the point, but I think it's interesting that you brought up that point as it pertains to it's not so much even necessarily loving the country as it is so much really disliking everything else outside of the country in terms of like an opposing country or whatever the case is. So I kind of see that sentiment even with internally, to where it's like the federal government really I think doesn't really like the states. And that's just my opinion and point of view. But when you look at the way that they act, especially as it pertains to their relationship to the states, I mean, am I kind of wrong, Tom? Or does it seem like there's kind of this love-hate or hate-hate relationship between the federal government and the states?
No, you're right. There is a sort of domestic imperialism. I mean, if you look at international imperialism, Nazi Germany or Italy or whatever they would, or Japan for that matter, would go abroad and conquer these other nations and subdue them. And that's what happened domestically in all of these fascist countries before they went abroad. They one of the things that Hitler had to do was he had to, even though they'd already, under the Weimar Republic, they'd passed gun control laws. He had to control and nationalize all of the local German police agencies, because the German police were very decentralized before Hitler took power. He had to create the German state police, the Gestapo, and ramp its power up in a way that it didn't have before under the Weimar Republic, because you need a monopoly on force if you're going to control a society completely. So local independent police would have been an impediment to that. And he took care of that by getting rid of that. So there is just as there was under Germany, there is a tendency among, I don't want to say fascist, because
Sure.
not everybody who does something you don't like is a fascist.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
and I don't want to
Yeah.
get into, oh, well, if you're for this, then you're a fascist.
Of
It's
course,
a
yeah.
whole, it's a whole panoply of a whole
Right.
worldview, and I think we can get a little too caught up in the, well, if you're for this one position which trends toward fascism, that makes you a fascist.
Yeah,
I don't think that's fair,
sure.
either to the person, to the person you're accusing, or to, accurate about fascism itself. It's a
Sure.
pretty broad statement of principles.
Yeah.
Not good ones, but a pretty broad statement of principles.
Yeah.
And the United States has embraced a number of them since the 1930s,
Mm.
really going
Yeah.
back to before the Second World War. And that was the reason John T. Flynn published his book. He said, hey, we're fighting fascism abroad, but we kind of have a little bit of it here in America under
Yeah.
the New Deal. They have this, we've set up under the New Deal, this immense bureaucracy. Gee, wouldn't you know, Roosevelt never balanced the budget, even during peacetime. Wouldn't you know? Like, he's got all of these things. It's like, wait a minute, what are we fighting abroad now?
Yeah.
And of course he could have even gone on and says, hey, wait a minute, we have colonies too. We have Puerto Rico, we have the Philippines, we have all of these, these colonies abroad, that the Panama Canal. He could have gone in that direction as well. He didn't, because his analysis of America was more contemporary to the 1930s.
Sure. Yep. And I think it's important, especially in these discussions, like it's good to, take a practical look at history, and see kind of the patterns that emerged there. But I think when you look at the way Flynn kind of set up his points, taking contemporary approach because it is relevant for that time, I think was also appropriate too. I mean, and so when you can take that history and you're like, okay, there's patterns here. This is what I'm seeing here. This is kind of what we're dealing with here. It does kind of make sense, and it helps create a far more cohesive argument, if you will. So
absolutely,
and I know we kind of brushed over this just a little bit, but one of the things that I think some people might evaluate, especially post the Trump election, is like, are we are we actually living under fascism? And I know you did break this apart, but or is it become something that, like, well, there are nuances, as you pointed out, there are some nuances to that, suggesting that there are mechanisms that are somewhat fascist. Is it something that's been overblown, just like so many other different things, by the woke position, to where it's just like, nope, everything, like you said, everything I don't like is fascist, or whatever the case is. Like, is there a growing case to argue that it is becoming more fascist, at least, or is it something that is just kind of become more of a meme, I guess, at this point, versus like reality?
Can it be both? Can I say both?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, when I hear that, the Democrats and the captive media, the establishment media, I have to laugh, because most of the stuff that they're criticizing are things that the Biden administration did as well.
Exactly.
You can criticize President Trump, and should criticize President Trump for doing so many things unilaterally without authorization from Congress. He was just slapped down by the Supreme Court yesterday for his deporting Venezuelans to an El Salvadoran prison without any due process. Leave the 10th Amendment aside even for a second here, but that's leaving the 6th Amendment and due process aside as well, and standard international law. So Trump was slapped down. But if you go back just a couple years, President Biden was forgiving student loans without any authorization from Congress, and all spending has to come from Congress according to the Constitution, and he was doing that unilaterally. Now he got slapped down by the Supreme Court, and then he tried again, and and what it ended up just being a giant bonus for government employees. That was how they bragged about how we forgave 3 million people's student loans, and all they really did was give all their federal employees a bonus. That's all they did. Like they basically said, if you work for the federal government, guess what? Your student loans are forgiven. And because they are allowed, at least not they're allowed to, set salaries at random, but they must have found some money. I mean, one of my criticisms of Congress over especially the last 30 years, has been they write laws so loosely that and deliberately so that it gives the president maximum power. And the only way to take that power back is they have to override a veto, which requires 2/3 of Congress. Plus, it just never happens. Congress this goes back to the 30s as well. I mean, the Roosevelt administration got Congress to pass the National Recovery Act, the NRA, not the NRA with the guns, but the National Recovery Act. And it allowed the executive branch to basically make law. And the Supreme Court struck it down, saying, no, wait, Congress can't just make its own law. That's not how it works. Congress can't just say, oh, the president can make law, and now the president makes law. That's not how it works. Congress can't give away its power to make law. And that may come back and it did come back with the Biden administration. It may come back with the Trump administration with the tariffs, because Trump basically said, oh, there was this law in 1934. And guess what? It allows the president to raise tariffs if a country's threatening us. And I declare every country is threatening us, so therefore I'm raising all the tariffs. And I think the Supreme Court may come back and pull the reins in on that, or at least I hope they will.
I just have to make a point off of the tariff thing, if you'll allow me to, because I think it's kind of funny. I do listen to several other podcasts because I like getting different viewpoints, even if it's from different libertarians and whatnot, because they all kind of have their own way of getting to the point, essentially. And I had, I think it was on Dave Smith's one of his episodes, and he's like, Trump is talking about how effective tariffs worked and how great they were back in the, I think it was the mid 1800s. And he's like, yeah, but there's one big missing point here. We didn't have the Federal Reserve. We didn't have income tax. We didn't have all of these other things. And there were so many other things that contributed to the prosperity of our country. And it really wasn't tariffs. It was the fact that we weren't hyper-regulated, overtaxed, and overburdened with essentially insurmountable mountains of government overreach. And he's like, that's kind of an important point when you start to, look back at these different situations of like, oh, like the tariffs were great. Okay, but like, we're leaving out the rest of the conversation here. And I think he made a really good point about that. Not to deviate from our conversation tonight, but it's interesting because when you see these types of actions where, you have presidents that unilaterally go well beyond their delegated authority. I mean, it seems more and more like, I don't know, like incoherent, or they're just trying to like really reach for certain things to justify their position. And it's so easy to kind of pick it apart if you know what you're looking at.
The presidents are looking for a legacy because they're into themselves. They always have been. I mean, Biden wanted to run even right up to the end, even after everybody told him, man, you're too senile. And he's like, no, I got this. And everybody was, everybody had already given up on
Grandpa, take your medicine.
And Trump is, he's more in control of his mental facilities, but he's the same way. He is a showman. I mean, that's why you look around the world, the number of actors who have gone into politics is amazing. I mean, Vladimir Zelensky is an actor. He's a comedian actor. I mean, you could go up and down the spectrum across the world and across America. There's what Congress is full of performers, whether they be sports performers or weathermen or actors, or there's, I mean, Al Franken was an example, but I was putting together a list a while back, and I was like, wow. I mean, and it, Sonny Bono and Ronald Reagan kind of got it started, but but there's just tons of people who got into it. I mean, was it Will Grigg used to say, politics is show business for ugly people. But it's just that's plain awesome. Show business now. That's it's so just good. Show business now.
Yeah.
So that's the reality.
I love that. That is, I'm gonna have to remember that one. That's funny. I've never heard that before. But that's gonna go right in my hip pocket. So
there you go.
Go ahead.
Oh, and so that's where we're at. These guys want a legacy, and therefore they think, well, Congress isn't going to do anything because we have a zombie Congress. We have a Congress that literally doesn't pass a budget anymore. They don't. They all they do is they rubber stamp whatever was passed 2 years ago, and 2 years ago they just rubber stamped what was passed 4 years ago, and so on and so forth. I mean, a lot of the policies. I mean, like, it's sad to say it, but the people who were in Congress in the 1930s have more of an impact on congressional spending today than the people in Congress have on spending today. That's how it works. Because if you go back to the 1930s, that was when Social Security was created. That was, and they're still spending at the same levels. The taxes had to go up because people live longer. Back then, the average person, if you lived to 65, you only got 4 years of benefits before you died. Now you get 15. And you're more likely to live to get a benefit. So they had to increase the taxes more than tenfold. But that was created in the 30s. The farm price supports, all the programs where they pay farmers to milk their cows and pour the milk down the drain. That was started in the 1930s. If you go back, there's this beautiful old Woody Guthrie song called Deportees. And it was, he wrote it I think in the 50s, and it was about a plane crash in the late 40s. And it starts out, the peaches are rotting and the oranges are packed in creosote bins. And the idea, and basically what this was literally what had happened. What they did was they paid farmers to grow the crops, and then they destroyed the crops. And the song was covered by Johnny Cash and Johnny Rodriguez back in the 80s. This song Deportees.
Sure.
It was about the Bracero program. They'd bring laborers over to America to grow the crops. Then they'd destroy the crops. And then this one plane load of them died going back because they would have to go home at the end of the season. And it was just about the waste of it. Woody Guthrie, even though he was a commie, he knew that you don't grow food and destroy it. But we do. We still do it. We pay 100%. Farmers. Now we just pay them not to grow the crops. I mean, I was friends with a guy in Wisconsin a number of years ago. He owned 19 acres of cropland, and he was getting payments from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He'd never planted a single seed in his life. He was a real estate agent. He didn't have, but he was getting a check. But taxpayers are two-time losers for this, because the purpose of the program is to lower the quantity of goods in the market, so the price will go up. So you lose at the supermarket because the prices are higher, and then you lose on tax day because you have to pay for these dumb programs.
Right.
And they're automatically renewed. They're what's called mandatory spending. So, I mean, I'm getting a little far afield from fascism, but so much of what Congress does is baked into the cake. It is that immense bureaucracy, I guess.
Yeah.
When it comes to fascism, it you know, the fascist has to buy off elements of society.
Yeah.
It has to cartelize, not cartelize. What is the word that Flynn used? He talked about. I'm mad at myself already. The cynical.
I think I know what you're talking about.
That, you know, sort of get people in different groups. So he's got we've got the farmers in a group, and we pay them off so that they don't fight with the government because they're getting benefits. They think, oh, I may be paying $50,000 a year in taxes, but hey, I'm getting 12,000 in payments, so I'm doing great, you know. But you're not. People don't realize how much they pay for the free money that they get.
Sure.
That's the thing. You know, it goes back to, I was grateful that, hey, I got a $1,500 tax cut from Donald Trump back in 2017. But I also am smart enough to know that I probably paid about $15,000 in higher bills at the grocery store and everything else because of the inflation that was created, because the deficits had to be monetized and they created new money. And I was the last one to get it. So I lost out, but that's why Donald Trump got reelected. It was about money. It wasn't the reason Donald Trump got reelected had nothing to do with any of his policies. It was the median worker did better under Trump.
Sure.
They remembered that Trump said, I'm for you, and they got a tax cut. But they didn't know that, gee, that tax cut created new money, and it created inflation under Biden. And the average, or not the average, but the median worker under Biden did worse. And part of that was because of inflation under Trump. Now, inflation continued under Biden, so Biden gets just as much blame. But that's just the way it worked, because the average worker said, you know what? I did better under Trump. I did worse under Biden. I'll go with Trump. And that's it was as simple as that. It wasn't like someone called me after the election and said, I can't believe that a majority of America voted for a rapist. I'm like, what? No, they didn't vote for a rapist. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe Donald Trump raped anyone. I believe he would sexually assault someone, but that's not why they voted for him. They voted for him because they thought, well, we did better under Trump and we did worse under Biden. That was the sum total of it. So anyway.
Yeah, where was you know, so one thing that I think is, and we've already kind of gone over a few of these, but I have, you know, kind of in my own self notations, just the markers as they were of fascism, and not just simply economic, but I'd like to kind of delve into the consolidation and kind of how some of that works, but at the same time, kind of elaborating on their relationship with, you know, the private sector, and how how fascism really kind of intertwines itself as it pertains to, you know, the legal aspect pertaining to law enforcement. Because and you had kind of pointed out some of this earlier, but I think it might merit a little bit of expansion on those particular areas, especially as it pertains to the military. And I know that at least to the many libertarians I talk with on a pretty regular basis, you know, the MIC, or the military industrial complex, is kind of a big problem that we have, and it's certainly not the only one, but it'd be interesting to kind of see like where that all fits into the picture too, because I know that's kind of a pretty big concern, especially as we talk about like budgetary and economic things. So if you want to go into that, we certainly can do that for sure.
No, that's a big part of fascism, the
Yeah,
militarism, and it's a big part of the economics of it. It's not
yep,
a lot of people think, oh well, this is just a totalitarian being totalitarian. No, 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 no. This is how they build and maintain their power.
sure.
The
Yep.
you get this huge bureaucracy under the military.
Mm,
People make profits. They have jobs. They're dependent upon the military.
right.
They get loyal to it, and you have this outlandish these outlandish displays of patriotism and
Mm,
national pride. All you have to do is go to an NFL Super Bowl and you see, when we have the flyover from the military jets, and
yeah.
then thank you to all the police officers and all the other people that work for the
Yep.
government and the firefighters and the teachers and the doctors and the nurses. And
Yeah.
can we name someone who's
Uh,
not working for the government? No, we don't.
yeah.
We only have pride in the government workers,
Yeah.
and that's what it comes down to. There's this obnoxious. I remember after the 9/11, everybody had their flag out in their yard and everything, and
Mhm.
it's understandable to a certain
Yeah.
extent.
Mhm.
And my old friend Will Grigg used to call it. He said, "We're going under this national patriotgasm, like orgasm,
Yeah.
orgasm, patriotgasm."
Right.
And I was like, at first I thought, man, maybe you're being too harsh. But
Yeah.
as it turns out, he wasn't. He wasn't,
Yeah.
because we did terrible things. When all the
Yeah.
flags go out, terrible things happen. And of course, what happened? We
Yeah.
invaded Iraq, a country that did not attack us, and we broke the country.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
we invaded Afghanistan. Maybe we should have gone in with a small force and taken out Osama bin Laden, but we
Sure.
broke the country, and we
Yeah.
broke a whole bunch of other countries too, because all of these flags came out, and we broke our own Bill of Rights
Yeah.
by
100%.
creating these prisons, like not just like Guantanamo, but worse places like these
Yeah.
black sites all around the world, where people were just kidnapped off the streets of Europe or
Sure.
even America and whisked away to Lithuania or Poland or Thailand in
Mm.
a prison that officially didn't exist.
Sure.
We betrayed our own principles, and so that when all the flags come out, that's the time you have to really worry a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we're living in that time right now, but
Sure.
we sure were in 2001.
It does seem though that like even if we're not there right now, like upon the hour, it always does seem like it's not that far around the corner though, because it especially, I mean, just look at what's going on with Iran or what's going on with China in this whole like you can sense this buildup. Like they're really trying to like motivate people into like, hey, like if we can get enough support, right? Like and everybody's like totally for this, we're gonna be able to we might be able to get away with this. But recently, Trump, at least from what I've read, Trump kind of like was like, yeah, the Iran thing, probably, at least from what I read, probably not the best idea. And it seems like he relented a little bit on that, but it still seems like there's a perpetual pressure on China. I don't think that's really going to change unless we have like an insane, almost polar shift of thinking in terms of how we conduct ourselves in relation to China. We've kind of had a shift in how we conduct ourselves with Russia, which, I mean, to some degree, at least thank goodness for that, because that starts a whole other conglomeration of issues. But I mean, it never seems like it's that far away. And it's interesting, how you described, and I remember, not to date myself too much, but I was in school when 9/11 happened. I remember seeing the overwhelming amount of quote unquote patriotism and all the flags. And then it's like you go ahead all of these years, well over 20 years ago now, and it's like it almost seems like a lot of people have buyer's remorse because what did we get out of it? Well, for one, we got the Patriot Act, which,
Right.
and hindsight being 2020, everybody's like, oh, well, yeah, this is really coming around to roost now, and especially as it pertains to things like the real ID, which is a whole other. I mean, actually, to be fair, that might even fit into our discussion tonight because when we talk about identification and this whole notion of papers, please, it seems like a pretty contemporary topic. But I do get the sense that we're never really that far away from it, though, Tom. I feel like that rearing of the ugly head in the military industrial complex is always trying to find an excuse to get involved just to keep this war machine running. And with that, you get all of the wonderful little benefits that we've noticed over the many years, which tends to be more militarized police. I mean, you look at what the average police officer has today. I mean, my gosh, the mind I'm not even going that far back. In the 1980s, would not have even started to fathom some of the stuff that they have today. Like they probably would have thought this was insanity. And that's saying a lot about even the 80s, because the 80s was still kind of, it was starting going into the 90s, at least to my understanding, was when they they still were okay with like keeping a lot of the use of SWAT kind of reeled in, but it started to uptick. If I'm remembering correctly, it started to uptick late 80s, 90s, and then the 2000s is where they started using SWAT like all the time for just even some of the most basic things. So, I think there's a relationship there too, where the military industrial complex is there, and then you see it kind of seep over into just general law enforcement. I mean, by all means, I'll let you have the floor, but I mean, there's a lot that comes out from this, and I don't think it can be ignored in the conversation of fascism, really.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm older than you, and I remember in the 80s when the first SWAT team was created. It was created by Daryl Gates in Los Angeles. He was a police captain in the 70s. And of course the show came out almost immediately after that, the show SWAT.
Sure.
And I remember watching it as a kid. But it was, the idea behind it wasn't, we're going to use all these dynamic entries or whatever. We're going to have life-saving techniques, but it just became this, well, we're the badasses and we're going to break things. And as a result, what happened was we started losing 1,000 people. 1,000 people started getting shot every year by police in America. Whereas it's 5 or 7 in Britain or whatever, it's a single digits in Britain. I mean, Britain, as a way of contrast, until the 1980s, and even still now, I think the majority of British cops do not carry guns.
That's how I understand it. Yep.
Yeah. And then keep in mind, like, okay, now you can sort of say, yeah, but Britain's got gun control, but they have the right to keep and bear arms in their constitution.
Yes.
Well, a lot of people don't know it. We copied the British Bill of Rights. It says those subjects which are Protestants may have arms suitable to their own defense.
Yep.
Okay. So Britain, from the mid 1800s right up until the 1980s, when they started passing gun laws, had the right to keep and bear arms for citizens and had police banned from carrying weapons. Yeah. And it was fine. It was just fine. I mean, nobody was saying Britain was going to get taken over. Okay.
Right.
It was the world's biggest empire until the 40s. Really. I mean, like even economically, the United States had a larger GDP than Britain, I believe, in the late 1870s or early 1880s, compared to, for Britain proper. But if you include the British Empire, which included Ireland and India and all the rest, we didn't pass England until the 1940s, late 1940s. Britain still had a huge economy. So it was the world's biggest empire. Territorially, it was the world's biggest empire in history. And they did that with disarmed police, domestic, and so but we don't do that. We do the opposite today. And you're right.
We just drive a tank through your front door and or we'll gas you out, or we'll flashbang your kids, or shoot your dog, which is the popular one. Which is it's kind of ironic, because a lot of people will they love to kind of troll the Russian police and like, oh, they're so aggressive, and and I've watched we've all seen the videos, and it's insane, but it's almost laughably insane, because they literally take a tank and they drive, like an actual tank, and they drive it through the door, and they're just like, like, you didn't expect that. It's like, no, actually, like the whole world expected that. But it's like, for us to do it, it's like you can't even spoof on the Russians when you're kind of doing the same thing. And we're two different people, of course, but it's like, like, I don't know.
A lot of the stuff isn't even like, it's weird. There was in the 80s, there was this Russian comic that came to America. His name was Yakov Smirnov, and one of his bits doesn't even play anymore. One of his bits was, "America, what a country! I love America. You know why? Because one thing you have that we don't have: warning shots. In Russia, if you run from the police, they just shoot you, and that's warning for the next guy. But now they don't do warning shots. They don't. There's no warning shot.
Probably just shoot you instead. It's not a big deal.
It's like like it's the joke about they had a 9 o'clock curfew, and there's two policemen. One of them's a veteran, the other one is a newbie, and all the people are starting to run to their houses, and it's 10 minutes to 9. And the one of the Russian cops gets out his gun and shoots a guy dead, and he goes, "Yuri, why did you shoot that man? It wasn't even 9 o'clock." He goes, Boris, I know where this man lives. He would not have made it in time." I mean, that was another Yakov Smirnov bit, but I mean, we're almost to that point in America. I mean, we're almost there. So I don't know.
It's and I actually love the way that this is going, because I think these really are kind of the markers, because we see these types of things, and I guess if people really have this ridiculous obsession with doing the comparatives of Nazi Germany and fascism and all of these different things, it's like, well, okay, like, but if we really want to see these comparisons, like, let's actually bring it back down to the police forces, because there's a lot of stuff that we do that is very much like, it's not far off. I mean, especially look at COVID. My goodness, the types of stuff that they did during COVID was just, it would there's not even words to explain it. It's like, okay, but how are you actually any different from the very thing it is that you say that you hate? And it's and I tend to feel this point of like, what is the saying? It's if you hate something long enough, you tend to become what it is that you hate, or whatever the saying is. And I honestly, I don't even think some people hate it. I think that's just the way that they're kind of pre-wired. But I think the Rona was actually a really significant time for actually trying to like peel back the onion and see kind of all the layers that of the kind of like the fascist model could present. Not necessarily that it did in some cases, but could present. And I don't know if that necessarily makes a lot of sense, but that's kind of what my thought is on it.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at both fascism and communism,
Yeah.
they work a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I mean, there were elements of fascism in communism. Lenin
Sure.
eventually settled on his new economic plan, which was kind of a copycat of. I don't want to say it's copycat of what Mussolini was doing, because Mussolini was still young, that was just in power, but he did
Sure.
allow for some private enterprise. But in order to grab power, they both go for first the force. And what's the force? It's the military and the police, so that you have to have control, authoritative control over that.
Mm.
And you have to have control over the bureaucracy. And that's how Stalin got to power. He was a
Sure.
bureaucrat, you know. The next, you need at least to tame business. You don't have to control it completely, but you have to tame it and have some method of propagandizing the people. If you do have those four things, you're going to be able to take over the country. And I looked at last year and I thought, wow, they started going after Elon Musk, who is the richest man in the world, and saying, "Oh,
Yep.
well, we're gonna get him." And I thought, this is a test. This is really a test. Can business be tamed?
Sure.
And I think that's how they went after Musk after he did the Twitter files thing and revealed all of the secrets of the deep state, and how they were censoring the media and trying to control the captive media, and trying to shut down alternative media by using big tech platforms to dial down alternative points of view. I think that was a big test for me. I mean, if you were to ask me, is Trump a unique threat to American democracy and is he uniquely fascist? No.
Yeah.
But does he trend toward fascism like Biden? Yeah,
Sure.
kind of. I mean, he has a lot of those things in common. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, hear those words and think, "Oh, he just called Trump a fascist." No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got some fascist qualities.
Sure. Yep.
As did Biden, as did all of the previous presidents, really going back to FDR, at least, and probably a handful before that. Because it's fascism is this broad spectrum of policies under those 8 rules that John T. Flynn outlined, and they've all done some of them to some extent here and there. And I'm not convinced. I'm actually convinced that the deep state really didn't want Donald Trump to get reelected. They were just they did everything they could. And one of my pieces that came out a couple of weeks ago was about, well, how are elections rigged worldwide, but also in the United States? And we have the pretense of free elections here in the West. And it's not all fully it's not a full pretense, but the elections are heavily influenced by the deep state here and abroad. And there's sort of a scale, like how much of the manipulation of the electorate do we have to do? Now, they're not stuffing ballots like they do in Venezuela, but they are utilizing propaganda, nominally private propaganda by the state to push an agenda. They, as we saw in 2024, they did try to get Donald Trump off the ballot, saying, "Oh, well, he had committed this crime." But we have a long history in America of reelecting people from jail. There's just because you committed a crime doesn't mean you can't be elected. I mean, this goes back to America's founding. That when they passed the Sedition Act back in 1798, they convicted Matthew Lyons, a Vermont congressman, and put him in jail for calling John Adams corrupt. And the people of Vermont reelected him from his jail cell and sent him back to Congress.
Yeah.
And in Boston in the 1930s, John Michael Curley was a city councilor imprisoned for corruption, and the people of Boston sent him right back to the city council and eventually made him mayor. And I mean, I could go on. There was a labor leader. I'm trying to think of his name in the early 1900s who ran for president from jail and was on the ballot in almost every state.
Wow.
So there's huge precedent for that. So for the Democrats to come out and say, we're going to take him off the ballot, that was a pretty bold attempt, and it failed because the courts stopped it. I mean, I fear what happens when these courts get changed and packed with lackeys like the courts in Brazil.
Oh, for sure. Yep.
So that's my fear, because the lawfare didn't work, right? We tried to sue Donald Trump for, he was convicted of all of these felonies for saying Mar-a-Lago was worth a lot of money. Well, okay, so does everybody who's ever tried to evaluate a property. Oh, and he also kept secret documents, even though he's former president. We're going to charge him with that as a felony. Come on. All of these were made up crimes. And it was obvious, and it's being done globally. I mean, in Brazil, they did that to two presidents in a row. They did this President Lula, who was a socialist, who wasn't really on board with the Brazilian establishment. So they kicked him out and put him in prison so he couldn't run for re-election. And then when the center-right establishment leader didn't win and Bolsonaro won, then all of a sudden Lula was magically freed from jail and Bolsonaro was under indictment. And it was just amazing. And they did the same thing in France a couple of weeks ago, where the leader of the Popular Front, what was her name? Her father was a really a fascist tool, but she tries to be more modern.
I know who you're talking about.
Marine Le Pen. She was just convicted of some ridiculous crime with lawfare and disqualified from running for the president of France, even though she's the leading candidate. They did the same thing in Romania twice.
I was just going to say Romania.
Twice.
Yeah.
They had an election, and this guy who was the right winger won. And they're like, no, this doesn't count. And then they said they're going to have another election. And when it looked like he was going to win again, they said, oh, well, you committed a crime. You're not allowed to run. Right. It's one of those things. So that's the game they played. And of course, if it really gets extreme, if it's not a single leader, they can just do a full blown coup and get rid of the democracy entirely.
And when I say we, I guess I mean the U.S. federal government, but they tend to know a little something about a playful little coup and getting their own way. But that being said, I just want to hit on something. I want to hit on something real quick because you bring up Romania. Oh gosh, and it wasn't France, but I thought there was one other country, and it's escaping me, who also just recently, gosh, I wish I could remember the name of the country. But they had also had somebody else removed and they had been well liked, well supported, and it's like, you have so many of these people that are just they're just so excited to have things like NATO and the EU and all of these different things. And I had made an argument actually on a friend of mine's podcast because I'm very I have not even a love-hate relationship. I have a hate-hate relationship when it comes to NATO. I don't like it at all. And some might even say I'm rabid, but there's a reason for that, because when you look at like these organizations, and I guess I'm talking in a somewhat global sense, but when you look at these organizations and you look at all the concessions these countries make to be a part of these, and then you have some of these countries that are like, well, I can't really afford to do this, or I need to take care of my own people, or I don't want to go to war against Russia. Why should I have to be involved in this? And all of a sudden you have like the EU or NATO that's like, well, I know who's not going to get funding if you don't do this. And it's like the same thing with politicians or people that run and they're well liked. It's like, well, we just can't have that now, can we? And so they conveniently lean on some of the people in these countries, and they're like, hey, you definitely should not allow this person to get any more traction than they have, because they're about to like either kick us out or make our life very difficult, even though that exerting your sovereignty as a country is typically a good thing, because it breaks you free of the shackles of control, typically. But it's like, when I look at these different things, it's like, my goodness, there's a reason that I'm totally opposed to these, because when you have an entity that gets to come in and dictate your elections, your funds, whether or not you can actually take care of your people, as opposed to you have to fund this apparatus. I mean, I don't know exactly where or if it actually fits into the realm of fascism. And please, if you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it's like, you look at these massive organizations and it's like, it really does feed into this like industrial complex of not only militarism, but a consolidation of economy. But we're not really consolidating it, because you're still your own country and you can still have your own companies, but you still have to do what we tell you to do. And it's like, and yet there's people in so many of these countries, Tom, that are growing and increasingly against NATO, against the EU, because they're starting to realize, hey, we can't actually do the things that we want to do or that we should be doing, because they control more of our country than we do. And these are all a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. And I know this kind of brings it to a global level, but I also want to add in one more thing before I kind of relent to you. How does, given all of this, what is also the relationship between not just the sovereignty of countries, but the private sector, as it were, to fascism? What is that relationship like? And I know you touched on it a little bit in the very beginning, but it'd be nice to elaborate on that for people, because I don't think that I don't think that there's a lot of people that do understand that there is that existence of somewhat of a private sector, but that whole relationship is kind of weird, right?
Yeah, that's important. I do think abroad, I think the era of us championing other countries, like we having electoral systems like we had 100 years ago, where again, socialist Eugene Debs is running for president from jail. We don't, no, we're going to tell all the other countries, nope, you're not doing that. And, but one of the things we do from the private sector, you buy off and intimidate the competition. And this is why this is why I was particularly interested in Elon Musk. Here's a guy who basically made his living as a tax farmer. I mean, he made his fortune as a tax farmer. He built Tesla on the backs of all of these subsidies that all the Democrats voted for. Yeah, it was the carbon credits and the electrical vehicle credit that the federal government put together, and this is how he made his money. And he kind of poked the bull, and they were after him. And the idea behind it is they're supposed to toe the line once they get some money. I mean, the federal government has almost never abolished any program ever. But one of the
Right.
very few they abolished. I don't know if I must have told this story in one of the things I'd written for the Libertarian Institute, because I remember writing it recently, although I could never find the original quote. But Daryl Gates, who was in the 80s under the Rodney King era, the chief of police of the Los Angeles, and before that he was the guy who formed the first SWAT team.
Yep.
He was against this federal law enforcement assistance program. It was called the LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration.
Okay.
And it was created with the Gun Control Act of 1968, and it had a fairly small budget. And it basically, Gates's view was this: for 2% of my budget, they are my hiring staff, my accountants, my acquisition staff, my like they controlled every aspect of my department. That's how the federal government controls a local police agency. And they do the same thing with business subsidies, because you're not going to want to, if you're getting any money from the federal government, you're not going to want to attack them or say, well, I think the federal government should get out of this or that business. You're not going to. And they know from historical experience that business has been the bulwark of opposition to government overreach.
Sure.
It was after the Civil War, there was a cry to get rid of the income tax. It was the first income tax the United States had ever enacted. Yeah, during the first year of the Civil War, they did an apportion tax instead of an income tax. So in 1861, they passed an apportion tax, which basically was assessed against the states. But by 1862, they'd given up and they said, oh, we're going to do an income tax. So at the end of the war, a lot of the politicians wanted to keep it. They said, oh, this is pretty good. We're only getting people who are making more than $600 a year. And that's, and we can raise that. $600 a year was more than the average person made back then. And the local chambers of commerce started forming, and they became a powerful lobby and killed the income tax. That was the beginning of the chambers of commerce. And the power of business was recognized in being able to stop the government overreach. So the important thing was to tame them, to make them dependent upon whether it's the Federal Reserve. I mean, the Fed, if you listen to any realtor, they will give you Federal Reserve talking points about how, well, your house always has to go up in price. It always has to go up in value. It's an investment. I mean, it's not something you live in. It's an investment. Well, why would it be an investment? I mean, like that's saying you go to the grocery store and you buy a pineapple. Well, it's an investment. It'll go up in value. No, it's something you buy so that you can use. It's insane to say it's an investment. I mean, maybe if you're buying a rental property, but not if you're buying a house for yourself. That's insane. Right. But they will. That's Federal Reserve propaganda so that they can continue inflation. And so what they've done is they've tamed all of the business industries, not all of them, but many of them, and certainly the larger ones, by buying them off with federal contracts. If you look at all of the big tech companies, they all have 8-figure or higher contracts with the NSA, with the CIA, with the FBI, to give them intelligence to push whatever the foreign policy of the United States or domestic policy of the United States is. And they will continue to do so because it makes sense. Even one of the things the Twitter files revealed is that even for a couple, maybe $10 million that they got in FBI kickbacks for all of their censorship domestically, they were bragging about it all across Twitter. Hey, we got $10 million from the FBI. And the goal, of course, is to make them subservient to Washington. And it largely works. It doesn't always work. Obviously, in Elon Musk's case, it didn't work, at least that one time. I'm skeptical of Elon Musk and where he's at, but he definitely did this country a solid when he bought Twitter and did the Twitter files. Whatever
sure.
he does after that, Twitter is not as free as Rumble or some of the other Telegram was. I don't know if it still is. It's not as free as those platforms. But what he did with the Twitter files and revealing what the federal government was doing to us was invaluable to anyone who wants freedom. Americans deserve to give him at least thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just kind of looking back at some of the stuff that we've covered, and just kind of at least bow tying like this particular segment, I think there's some really important points. So, we talked about Flynn's 8, and we talked about the relationship and the history and all of these different things. And I think that when we look at the overall package of fascism, there is a military component, there is a control of the local law enforcement, there is a consolidation that occurs. But I think one of the big things that a lot of people don't fundamentally understand, and we just talked about it, is the relationship it has with private entities. And the fact that I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, there is nothing private in fascism. It's like, no. Like the thing is keeping it private is really a way to augment their ability to control different things. And if they can use that as kind of an outlet, like we had kind of talked about, especially through subsidies and all of these really nice bow-tied packaged items that they like to put out there, it really gives them an advantage. And, and you had just mentioned too, a private company is a pretty solid bulwark when it comes to certain aspects of governments, like fascism, for instance. They do have a lot of power, and one of the things that I've brought up in conversations with several people is the importance of private property, and the fact of how property rights play a huge role in the grand scheme of liberty and being able to secure liberty, and utilizing property rights, especially as it pertains to securing all other rights as well. And I think that this is definitely a case here. And I think we've made, or at least outlined, a pretty interesting area of conversation regarding fascism, as it were, at least with this particular segment. And I want to give you an opportunity just to kind of add a bow tie to this. And then there's a couple other things that I'd like to kind of go over, which shouldn't be too much longer, but I'd really like to get your opinion on that, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's fine. No, what you're talking about is right. I mean, under socialism, government owns all the stuff, right? I mean, government owns the means of production.
Sure.
And one of the things I loved about Lew Rockwell, he's still around, but he stepped down from the Mises Institute. But he used to say, well, how can you? One of the socialism inevitably trends toward totalitarianism, and how could it not? If government owns all the stuff, well, how can you have a freedom of press if the government owns all the press? It owns, if it owns all the paper and all the ink and all, it owns the airwaves. You can't. How do you have freedom of religion if government owns all the property? Well, where can you build a church if government owns all the property?
Sure.
How can you have freedom of speech if government owns all the commons and it tells you where you can speak? That's it. And the same goes for fascism, because fascism is they would give you detailed instructions on how you can use your property. So it's nominally private. So in that sense, you think you own your property, but you really don't. It's owned by the state. I mean, Fiat, the head of Fiat during Mussolini's reign, he was senator for life under Mussolini's government. But the government ran fiat.
Yeah.
Fiat stopped making civilian automobiles, midway into the war or early in the war because they had to make more military trucks and tanks and airplanes and all the rest. So it was totally controlled.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can go down the list here and let's do this. Let's go down the list and see where are we in America with these eight characteristics, in which government acknowledges no restraint on its powers, totalitarianism. Are we there? Probably not.
Yeah.
But presidents in both parties are trying to do just that, right?
Sure.
They're not, they're flirting with thwarting the courts. They're legislating on their own, even though that's the responsibility of Congress. And they're getting some pushback, but not, in my opinion, not enough, in which unrestrained government is managed by the dictator, the leadership principle. And in this case, I don't think we have it. I don't think that exists with Trump. Sure. I don't think it existed with Biden. I think Biden was a puppet. I think the people in the deep state who really run the government didn't want Trump, but they're kind of okay with it now that he's doing most of what they want, but they don't like some of the things that he's doing. They want a war with Iran and he's not going along with it. They want him to stop with the tariff foolishness, and he's kind of stopping. I mean, there's Trump was 95% on their side, but not enough. Right. That's why they didn't want Trump. But I don't think we have the leadership principle just yet, in which the government is organized to operate the capitalist system under an immense bureaucracy. We obviously have a huge bureaucracy.
100%.
Everything is, not everything, but many, many things are subsidized. We're organized on the syndicalist model, not strictly speaking. And syndicalism is, a lot of times, it's bringing the different segments into the government formally. Like one of the things Mussolini did was his Grand Council of Fascism brought unions into the government. He brought business into the government formally as business, that type of thing. We haven't done it formally that way. Our way has been more like the Japanese system in Imperial Japan, like the Zaibatsu, where you have these giant conglomerates, technically outside the government, but they influence the government and the government controls them as well. So with there's some of that, but it's not really the same level of formality that Flynn is talking about here, in which the government and syndicalist organizations operate the capitalist society in the planned autarchical principle. Now, planned, to a certain extent, we have a planned economy. In other respects, we don't. In autarky, we are moving a little bit more toward our autarky with Trump's tariffs. The idea is we want to be more independent. We don't want to have these cheap Chinese imports. So you could argue, okay, maybe a little bit more under Trump than under Biden, in which government holds itself responsible to the nation with adequate purchasing power and public spending and borrowing. We've had that since the 1930s, and it's worse than ever. So yes, double check on that one, right? Militarism is used as a conscious mechanism of government spending. I would say check on that one as well. And imperialism is used as policy, inevitably flowing from militarism and other elements of fascism. Absolutely check there too. One of the big, when they say other elements of fascism, where you have government and the corporations sort of unified together. One of the best examples of fascism on a global scale was the Iranian coup back in 1953. Because what had happened was Iran had gone democratic. They had this President Mohammad Mossadegh who was maybe a little socialist, but he wasn't like a commie or anything. Right. He wanted to, the Iranians had been forced by the British to sign this terrible deal with the British Petroleum to basically let them rape the country of all their oil resources. And Mossadegh said basically, we're canceling that deal and we're gonna nationalize the oil industry. And so BP went to MI6 and said, we think the guy's a commie. Can you do a coup? And MI6, and this is the 1950s, they couldn't do it. So then they went to the CIA, and John Foster, not John Foster Dulles, he was the Secretary of State. Allen Dulles in the CIA said, yeah, we could do that for you. So we did a coup on behalf of British Petroleum so that they could take Iran's oil. That and of course we got some of it too out of the deal too. But the and that created the Shah, and of course the backlash in 1979 was the the hostage crisis and the Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini and all the rest of it. So I mean that goes back a long ways. That number 8.
No, and that's I think that was a perfect way of really kind of explaining that whole first segment in very nice little nuanced bites. Those 8 points I think are worth continuously going back and in evaluating and kind of seeing like, okay, can we fully check another box, or is it kind of partially there? So I love that. Now the second segment, which will bleed kind of into the final one, it won't take as long, but there was one thing before that, and I can't remember if it was I can't remember if it was in the second article after your initial one on fascism, or if it was the third one. My memory doesn't serve me that well all the time, but you did bring up Tesla, or I think it was the third one, when you had kind of brought up the Teslas and how you have these people that are going around and keying and they scream about Nazism and you did you made a point about people who are spray painting the Teslas. And then you did a really nice breakdown of like, okay, well, if you look at the disparities, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you pointed out like, okay, there's like 3/4 of them are Democrats, and the other quarter are like the rest of them are like Azov, or something, and I just kind of chuckled at that, and I'm just like, like that,
only a slight exaggeration. That was my joke, that they'd cornered the market. The left had cornered the market on swastikas, or at least the Democratic Party, because a lot of them were just they're painting swastikas on Teslas owned by liberals who are often Jewish guys. I mean, it was just like, what kind of world do we live in? And then the other swastikas globally are being done by the Azov battalion in Ukraine. But one of the interesting things is we haven't talked about racism or anti-Semitism, because that's not one of the essential elements of fascism. Mussolini did kill Jews, but he didn't kill Jews because he believed Jews were bad. He killed Jews because he was under Adolf Hitler's power at the very end of the war, because his fascism really didn't have anything to do with hating Jews or hating other races that much. I mean, he loved Italian, and he wanted to bring back the Roman Empire, but it wasn't so much about racial purity with him. It was with Hitler, obviously. And it certainly was. It wasn't like that with Franco or in Portugal with Salazar. That's not what it was about. And so it's not an essential element of fascism. It does play into fascism, because if you are an imperialist nation, well, it helps to be think of your nation as better than all the rest, and all the other nations being lesser people, or the Untermenschen or whatever. It helps, but it's not an essential element as long as you still have the militarism. So We haven't really, that's one of the interesting things. We went, what, an hour and whatever, 20 minutes, and we didn't even mention racism
Yeah.
because it's not an essential element. Now, it is
Right.
part of it in some places, but
Sure. Yeah.
it just a lot of people made a big deal out of Elon Musk trolling everybody with his Hitler salute or whatever they want to call it.
Oh yeah. His, yeah.
But I don't think that makes him the world's greatest danger or necessarily a Nazi
Right.
or whatever. I mean, I think people make too much of symbolism.
Yeah.
I know it's strange for a Catholic like me to think, you make too much of the symbolism because
Well,
that's all we do. I just
yeah.
came back from the Easter Vigil, and like the whole thing was symbolism, but I think
Yeah.
you don't want to make too much out of the symbolism
Right.
unless it's explained beforehand. At least
Right.
in the
Well,
case of
I have full discrepancy, full disclosure. It's one Catholic speaking to another, so I totally understand exactly where you're talking, what you're talking about, and what you're speaking to, and you know, just to kind of stay on this topic just briefly. Um, I had followed to varying degrees, but since like 2014, I remember vaguely following the situation since the Maidan, and I didn't really understand it. And initially, I was just like, holy crap, like this is wild because we hadn't really seen something in that part of the world go down like that, but then also everything that subsequently happened, and then it started to involve Russian speaking individuals in the East, and then we were just like, okay, well, this is going to start to escalate. And I remember seeing a lot of the initial things, so I come into that whole situation all the way up to today with remembering a lot of things that happened just before, during the Maidan, and then after the Maidan, and all of that. But one thing I remember, and Vice, I'm pretty sure it was Vice that did it, but they did a piece actually covering Azov. And I remember looking at that back in the day, and I'm like, wow, like it's kind of interesting because the way that they kind of molded it is they're like, yeah, these guys are extreme, but like, they're fighting for their country. And I'm like, oh wow, okay, so that I somewhat got sucked into the appeal because I was like, oh wow, so they kind of have something. They ended up doing something like Americans kind of have a wet dream about, this brilliant, militia type thing. And then it's like the more and more I looked at it, I'm like, wait a minute, like this is getting kind of weird now. All right. You can kind of turn off some of the you can kind of tone down some of the rhetoric here, bud. And then amazingly, all of the mainstream media was like, oh, these people are literally Nazis. Like they are praising the Nazis. They love, they have the paraphernalia, everything about it. And then 2022 happens and it all turns off. And it's like, that was always perplexing to me, but I to some degree not surprising, because it's like, okay, so now we're switching gears to potentially supporting a regime that outwardly is espousing certain views that are very that was always like a no view, and now this is where we're at. And so when we look at symbology, I mean, do you think, in your opinion, do you think the symbology is kind of blown out of proportion as to what people are seeing, or what is your perspective on that? And it's just a brief thing, but I am kind of interested because we are talking about fascism, and I think when we do talk about that, having a contemporary example, especially with what's been going on in Kiev, and a lot of people have been saying that really the extremists, especially Azov, are the ones that are really influencing Kiev's role in the war, and their non-willingness to seem to want to actually come to the table. They're trying to drive this forward, aside from like the West being like, we'll give you all the weapons in the world. So what is your perspective on that? I was really kind of curious about that.
Well, I'm not
I
really
know
the
it's a
best
loaded
expert.
question, but
Yeah, I'm not really the best expert on this.
sure.
I was what you referenced one of my pieces where I said the Democrats had cornered the market on swastikas, and
Yeah,
a quarter of them were the Azov
sure.
Brigade, but that was just more the a lighthearted
Oh, for
remark
sure.
of, about the piece. It's not really my area of expertise, and
Yeah,
I'd rather Scott Horton talk about it. Now he's convinced they're pretty hardcore Nazi, actual
yeah,
Nazi, not neo-Nazi, Nazi.
yeah,
Um, but I haven't looked into it enough to really
sure. Yeah,
get a state my opinion. I've learned not to do that because
sure.
I've
Yeah,
I've stepped in the wrong puddle in the past, so I don't want to do that.
yeah. No, that's fair.
But I
Yeah,
think here's going back to one of your other points that you made
yeah.
earlier, which is the media just flipped a switch in 2022
Mm,
where they said, "Oh, these guys are Nazis," and then the Russians invade. All of a sudden, oh, they're great patriots.
yeah,
I think
yep.
I think going back to my point about how government can buy off media business, which media is a
Mm,
business. The big
yes,
I call it the captive media.
sure.
By captive, I mean I go back to my old John Birch Society days. They used to talk
Mm,
about the captive nations, the nations that were under the sway of the Soviet Union, like the old
yep.
Eastern European countries. Now there are captive corporations that are under the sway of the military industrial complex and especially the intelligence agencies in the United States.
Yep.
And we have the benefit, not just of the Twitter files, but of so many examples of that switch flip where we can kind of tell who's under the sway and who's not, because
Sure.
we can, we all you have to do is look at who was saying cheap fakes about
Yep.
Joe Biden not being alert in
Yeah.
August of 2024, and then after the debate, all of a sudden talking about how he's not alert. We have the example of all of the COVID lies being unturned. We have the
Mm,
example.
yeah.
We have so many examples. Now, one switch flip might not mean that the media company is under the control, but if
Right.
time after time after time they are, hey, these guys are not your friends. They're not
Sure.
reliable. They are probably worth listening to
Mm,
find out what the official lie is, but that's
yep.
about it. And so that's the way I do it. That's what I listen to those sources,
Yeah.
whether they be the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN,
Yep.
MSNBC, all of those, they and Fox, they will all tell you the certain lies. Fox will tell you slightly different lies because they're geared to the Republicans. But
Sure.
if you
Yep.
look, there's a lot of overlap between the two. And if you look
Absolutely.
at the switch flips, you see where they're going.
Yeah. No, and I think that was actually a great point that you jumped off on, because it really, I do think overall, when especially as it pertains to that situation that's going on over in Eastern Europe with Ukraine and Russia, like, to me that really was a significant thing that I noticed, and it was so significant to the point where it's just like, okay, why is nobody else talking about this? But I think you did a great job of kind of explaining exactly why that's the case. So I thank you very much for that, because I think that was a great point. Now, the segment 2 and the final segment kind of bleed together, so we'll make this kind of quick. But I kind of went into it when I had sent the outline. I kind of went into, like, why is it that people, at least in my mind, tend to lean towards socialism or communism as the mechanism or structure to blame for most of our problems, especially when it comes to the economy, when it comes to consolidation, when it comes to so many other things. Instead of potentially like pointing out, like, okay, well, but maybe it's more fascist in nature. Maybe it's more like akin to the 8 points that Flynn makes. Is there like an education schism? Do people not fundamentally understand the differences? Or are we just taught in the United States that, like, no matter what, like anything bad or authoritarian or totalitarian at today is going to forever be akin to the Soviet Union or Mao's China, and so we have to look at it through that scope. And that's notwithstanding, obviously, the rabid Hitler bad type of mentality, but the evaluation of fascism as being a potentiality in the United States just does not seem. It seems to be overshadowed by socialism or communism, and I'm just kind of curious: is there really just an education schism, or are we just ignoring things here?
That's a really good question. I think it's a couple of different things. First of all, socialism is simple.
Sure.
I don't, there may be an education issue, but socialism is simple, right? Either government runs healthcare or it doesn't.
Sure.
You either have socialism or you don't.
Right.
So, and in America, we kind of have a little bit of socialism. We have Medicare and Medicaid, but we don't have full socialism. In America, we have medical fascism. And people tend to think, well, we have a free market, but we don't really have a free market. And that's what complicates it. If you look at the different markets across the U.S. economy, some of them are pretty free market, despite heavy taxation and stuff. Electronics, agriculture, mostly, even though, we do have the regulations for inspection and stuff, especially the meat slaughterhouses is a terrible example. But if you want to sell grain, for example, there's not a lot of restrictions on it. So it's a fairly free market. It's another thing if you want to slaughter cows. There's no, they had to raise $300 million to create a fifth slaughterhouse in America, for mass butchering.
Better be careful with all that raw milk too, Tom. Otherwise, they might not like you very much.
No, that's it. But that makes it more complicated, doesn't it? Because we have some markets that are kind of free and some that are heavily regulated, and there's corruption in varying degrees at varying things. So it's tough to parse it all out. And I think that's part of the problem. But if you look at the markets, if you look at just generally at economies, the more the government spends, and that can be in the form of straight up socialism, or it can be in the form of a bureaucracy that regulates private enterprise.
Sure.
The worse the economy performs, and the smaller the government is, the better the economy performs. So we can look at it out from that perspective, out from 35,000 feet, and see, okay, fascism doesn't work quite as well, but it works better than socialism as far as bringing products to people. Because socialism doesn't work.
Right.
If you look at any of the socialist products, they're the worst products.
They are.
One of my colleagues at the Libertarian Institute, he just ran a piece about how one of the candidates for mayor of New York City is talking about creating government grocery stores in New York City because he's afraid of all the grocery deserts. Now, they did that in Chicago, and they lost, I think it was $100,000 per store per year. And the quality of the food was so bad that nobody wanted to go there anyway. It was just one of those, like, it's just bad. So socialism is one of those things that's so openly bad that people recognize it. But fascism, because it's more complex, because you deal with regulations and corruption is intertwined with it. It's really fascism is largely government corruption with the private sector. You could almost define it that way.
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable definition too. Like that makes a lot of sense to me.
There's a fake quote going out there about Mussolini saying that fascism is the union of corporate and government power. He never said it. It's also attributed to his main economist, Mazzoli. He never said it either. But there's an element of truth to that. He actually formalized it too. He formalized it by bringing government business into the government. But the main element of it is the corruption of business and the corruption of government. It's almost like looking at a penny, and a free market's here, and it's almost like a free market person looking at a penny and a socialist looking at a penny. And the free market, the socialist looks at the backside of an old wheat penny and says, see the wheat there, that's a private sector product. That's a farm product. That's industry. That's the corruption of industry. And the free market guy turns it around and says, see that picture of Lincoln there? He's a government official. It's the government corruption, but it's the same penny. It's the same penny. And that's fascism. And that's part of the problem, because it's a little of both. And it's the two of them together in a corrupt relationship that is on a spectrum, right? Because you can have a tiny bit of fascism, but you could also have it full blown, like there was in Germany and Italy and Imperial Japan and the rest of them.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a really good and fair, and I would even say honest comparison and contrast between the two, because I do think, as with many of the topics that I've covered so far, there's always going to be an education schism. I do think in many ways that is by design, because it's it's so much easier to create a sense of control and containment of the population and get them to do the things that you want to do. History tends to, at least in my mind, history tends to support that notion. But I do think that, like, there is this idea that, everything that's wrong in our country is just, it's those darn commies, they're back at it again. And it's like, well, but is it really attributed to the darn, flag waving commie down the road, or is it something else? And I think it really is important to identify these markers and to get a good sense of what those differences are. Because I've always taken the position that if you don't at least begin to understand what it is that you oppose, and more especially what it is that you support, it becomes very hard to wage a good battle and a good worthwhile cause and fight for the things that you want to see an outcome to, especially as it pertains to liberty. So just to kind of wrap up here, kind of given the conversation of tonight, I guess, as always, where do we go from here? What is the most meaningful thing that we can do as individuals to try and mitigate or avoid, or even try to fight back against stuff like this? I've always been an advocate, as well as many libertarians, and I suspect you are too, of really doing the best that we can at a local and state level, as a really good bulwark against any type of overwhelming or overreaching government. But I'd really like to get kind of your closing thoughts in regard to that, and anything that people might find useful. So
I think you're right. Part of it is education, at least in the short term, education and localism, whether it be nullification at the state
Mm,
level or even localism beyond, pulling it from the state level down to the local
sure.
level, just being non-compliant, as Jefferson and Madison did in 1798 with the Virginia
Mm,
and Kentucky resolutions. You talk about nullification and interposition. Those
yep.
will all help. I'm convinced that Madisonian liberalism in the classical sense is
Mm,
kind of been a failure to fascism because of the corruption of government money in business.
sure.
I think long term, ultimately, we need to disenfranchise the state, and
Sure.
this is just me talking. Nobody else has endorsed it, but I did write about it a couple of last year at the Libertarian Institute, where I think the voting franchise has to be yanked from anyone who received a check in the last 2 years or whatever the previous
Sure.
election cycle was, from the government. Because if
Yeah.
too many people vote their pocketbooks, and government can just buy off enough of the voting block, and then you add in those who are uneducated, you often got a majority.
Yeah.
So unless the only exception is those rare cases where the economy is collapsing, like happened in Venezuela,
Yep.
or like happened in Argentina, and people choose to go with someone else.
Sure.
But I think ultimately the long term is the voting process, or the voting eligibility, needs to be rejiggered so that the people who aren't living off taxes do the
Yeah.
voting, and the people living off taxes, we basically say, well, you are the government. You don't need to vote on the government. I think that long
Yeah.
term is going to have to be the case.
Sure.
There are all kinds of ways to go about it, compromising it and doing it short
Mhm.
term or medium term. But this is going to be super unpopular, because everybody's going to say, what, you think if I work for the government, I shouldn't have a vote? My answer is, yeah, I do. But no, people don't accept that, because we've
Yeah.
assumed in our culture, well, I have a right to a vote. But the right to a vote is a process, right?
Yeah.
It's not an inherent natural right, like your right to
Mm,
property, your right to your
mhm.
wages that you've earned. And it's a
Sure.
it's a different kind of thing, but people aren't accustomed to that.
Yeah.
So that's my radical libertarian idea for the night.
Well, and I just have to add on to that a little bit. I mean, initially, when we started as a country, heck, if you didn't actually have property, as I understand it, you didn't really have a say. And there's some people that are like, I don't know, man, maybe we should go, maybe we should go back to that. But I think that becomes a complex situation, considering where things are at now, because it's like, okay, well, a lot of people can't afford like an actual home these days, and so but I think it's I when you were bringing your point up, I was just like, oh yeah, like we kind of actually had a situation to where it's like, no, you have to actually own property in order to be able to uh, have a fundamental say in a lot of things.
But
So I
that, if you go back to then, the only
yeah
taxes were property taxes. So
yeah yeah
taxation, like our American Revolution was fought over taxation and representation go
yeah
together. So if you own property, you pay taxes, you get a vote. If you don't pay taxes, well, you don't get a vote. And
yeah
that's not. And my point was simply, if you are a taxpayer, you get
yeah
a vote. If you are a tax taker, you don't get a vote.
yeah yeah
And I think that solves the issue of fascism and the corruption, because the incentive is no longer there. You can't
yeah
buy your way, whether it's
sure
with a welfare check or a corporate welfare check,
yeah
or you work for a defense contractor. Because I would do it indirectly too, for if you work for a
sure
company that gets
yeah
contracts. I think that would be the best way. But I mean, there's a
yeah
lot of people who would say, what are you saying? With my, if I'm on Social Security, I can't, we could do a temporary, there are all kinds of ways to phase it in,
oh
or
100%
whatever.
yeah
But I mean, I think ultimately that's the only way to stop fascism, is to
Right.
change the incentive system, because right now the incentive system is,
Yeah.
let's buy off the votes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when we talk about incentives, there's a lot of areas, notwithstanding that we haven't even talked about yet. And that's for obviously another time. But no, I think you make a great point there, and I think in the grand scheme of things, we really do have to also. I just had a conversation with the same people today that I brought up earlier, but it's like, look, like we get so wrapped up into the grand scheme of the federal issues, but it's like we were designed to have most of the power to the people in the states, and it's like because we're not acting in accordance with the power structure that we have, it's no wonder that everything is so disproportionately balanced, and that's always good. It's probably going to be my push, and it's the hill I will die on. It's like, look, like even if you get your community, even if you can get your community to be somewhat balanced in terms of valuing liberty, but also being able to have some structure that's going to support liberty and a reasonable, sense of governance, I guess. Um, to me, that's a win. Yeah, it might not be the whole state, but it is something. And I hate that I can't remember, but um, if I recall, there was a couple times where the founders had kind of alluded to the idea that, look, liberty is not something that you win in large leaps and bounds. It's often very incremental and it's often very tedious. But in the end of the day, like if you continue to work at it, which it doesn't, there is no end. You will start to see movement in the right direction, and I still believe that. I still think that those little wins that we do get here and there, they do mean something. I don't think they're meaningless. So, um, I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, and bringing on people with great perspectives such as yourself, because we need to have more of these conversations, Tom, and we need to also have a sense of learning about these different subjects so we can better, augment our ability to bring liberty back to our communities and our states, and I think that's huge. So, with that being said, any closing thoughts you have? Please feel free. You have the floor, and we'll wrap it up.
Well, thanks. I think I've talked enough. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
good. Yeah.
yeah. All
This,
right.
but it's been, I've appreciated the conversation though. This was fun. I'm not,
Yeah,
even though it's 1:00 a.m., I'm not tired, and my bedtime is usually way before this. So I
yeah.
appreciate this.
I,
Yeah.
I I hear you too.
Yeah.
So no, I greatly appreciate it. And if you have a couple minutes after, I'd like to just talk to you
I'll
for a
stick
minute.
around. Yeah.
But yeah, I would love to have you come back on. Obviously, there's many other subjects that I feel we have yet to talk about, and we kind of have alluded to them this time and the previous time you were on. So I would absolutely love to have the opportunity to do that. Again, I know we kind of it's kind of self-explanatory, but where people can find you is predominantly the Libertarian Institute. Um,
That's right.
you have a ton of great articles on there. I've started combing through even some of the works that aren't as recent, and I think they're worth a read. Anytime you have the opportunity to go and look at different subjects and stuff like that, whether it's by Tom or many of the other contributors at the Libertarian Institute, it's a worthwhile read. There's always something to learn. So, with that being said, I really want to thank everybody for stopping in this evening. Thank you for taking the time with myself and with Tom and listening to kind of what we have to say and some of the banter. And I hope that you really got something out of this. I feel like it was a very important conversation to have, in understanding the critical distinctions between fascism and other types of authoritarianism and control mechanisms that do exist, as well as kind of understanding some of the nuances about it. So hopefully you can take this information and go forth and make a reasonable impact in your in your communities, in your states, and for it all to eventually end up in a greater win for not only liberty, but for the future generations in our posterity. So on that note, happy Easter to everybody, and we will all see you down the road next Saturday. I will be posting an update and letting you know what next Saturday is going to hold, and that will either drop probably either tomorrow night or it's going to be sometime on Monday, so stay tuned for that. With that being said, always keep moving forward, always keep supporting liberty, and be good to each other. That's all I can really ask, because nobody else can make a greater impact than all of us. So take care, God bless, and we'll talk to you soon.